Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for tuning in and watching us on channel 347 on DSTV. Now, as we do on a Thursday as well, we have conversations with insight. And tonight we're discussing spiritual bypassing. In studio, I'd like to welcome back Sister Shaamiela Safodien. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thanks for taking the time and joining us again. We really appreciate it. Last week's edition was really informative, so it kept me up.
Oh, it did.
Thank you. It wasn't just load shedding.
I hope it gave you hope.
It gave me
Inshallah.
a lot of hope. It gave me hope in terms of just a better insight in terms of the topic hope as well. So spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting topic as well.
It
And sometimes when we hear these wonderful words, we often associate it with being a new age term, if I can deem it as well. Is it so? And can we maybe begin by defining what spiritual bypassing is?
I mean, it's completely understandable that it feels like a new age term, particularly because of the advent of sort of the wellness industry on social media. And so I find that's often where you find these terms.
Okay, yeah.
And it's often thrown around and you don't really understand sort of the details around it. But it's quite old. It was coined in the 80s by a transpersonal psychologist and psychotherapist. And he started noticing basically how people used spiritual ideas and spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices as a way to bypass emotional wounding, emotional beliefs, psychological difficulties, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so it's almost as if instead of looking at those things and delving deeper into those things and trying to understand them, we would use these practices to just bypass and name it enlightenment, saying that they're, moving towards becoming more enlightened, and that they didn't really need to bother with, the emotional wounding aspect and understanding it.
And that in itself is a separate episode, in terms of trauma, in terms of dealing with issues and challenges that one has been through in their life as well. But the term itself, I mean, it encompasses more or less what we deal with in our everyday life. And you mentioned something very important in terms of social media and how that can play an impact on throwing things out there that we may not always get the right understanding of.
Yes.
Do you find that?
100%. And it's something it's a conversation because it's sort of, social media, it's sort of made its, I always say to my clients, it's made its way into the clinical practice and into the rooms of the therapeutic sessions. Because they'll often come and say, like, I read this, on social media and so on and so forth. And so what I like about it is that the language is becoming more normalized around trauma, around mental health, around psychological issues. I think the difficulty for me and the challenge is that sometimes it's really complex issues. And whoever the person is who posts, they'll take a really complex issue and they'll, spread that out over 10 slides. And so now people think, okay, I get that. I understand what this is about, right? And so what I say to my clients is that's awesome. That's really a great form of information, but I need you to personalize this for yourself. Like, how does this show up in your life, right? So, I mean, again, this is even this discussion. It's a generalized discussion, but we've got to make space for nuance.
Of course. Right? And out of those 10 slides, 4 of those slides may apply to your life.
There we go.
And not all 10 will be, relevant to what you're going through at that time as well.
Exactly. And so, I think, again, just the language and familiarizing yourself with that, but it's really important for you to go into a process where you are delving into that, and whether that's, with a guide, a coach, a counselor, with therapist, but it's really helpful to have someone else also hold you accountable in some way and help you to work through those things, because sometimes it can be really difficult to look at those things more deeply.
And more importantly, accept it.
Yes.
And want to heal from that.
Right.
Okay, I get you. What are some of the signs of spiritual bypassing?
Okay, so I think one of the big ones is that people tend to believe that they need to overcome their emotions. That's the terminology we use. Overcome their emotions, knock the obstacles out the way. Often there is the you'll notice people that live sort of in the spiritual realm. They're not really present in the here and now. Tend to kind of go, okay, you know what, I need to sort of leave this moment and meditate, pray, that kind of thing. Again, these things they're not bad. Sometimes what we see is that there's often a sort of a judgment and a superiority sometimes when people delve into spiritual bypassing, and they tend to judge other people's experiences of emotional turmoil.
Without fully understanding
exactly
what went on.
Right.
I wouldn't say, I was going to use the word wrong, but that's a wrong word. But what went on?
Yes, exactly. So that type of thing, and the judgment is very much around kind of you've got to again rise above your situation. There isn't space for this, and then often sometimes also deeming certain emotions and experiences negative versus positive. Right, and not understanding the duality of the experience, the human experience, essentially. Right, that we encounter negative and positive. They all are actually quite positive if you think about it, because they're there to propel you forward and to really help you grow as a person.
Absolutely. So you mentioned our emotional experience, right? Why is that important for this to, for us to give this our attention, particularly with us being Muslim and in our Islamic culture?
Right. Yeah. So, I want to be really real with our community. And I say this obviously in a way that, again, just to say that this is a generalized discussion. There's obviously always space for nuance. But I find that we are a community that's really well versed in ritual and very well versed in sort of spiritual practices. But very often what I see in my rooms is people who are, again, well versed in those things and really have a complete life in that way, but they lack an emotional connection. There tends to be a detachment, sometimes even severe dissociation from the emotional realm. And so what I find is that there's this disconnect that they feel, right? So people will say I recite my Quran, I have many sittings where I make dhikr, I meditate often, whatever the practice is, but I don't seem to be able to move forward or overcome, whatever issues it is that I have. And sometimes it's because what we tend to believe, and I think in our Muslim community is that it has to be either or, right? So yes, those practices are really important. They have been a saving grace for many, many people when they go through difficulty. But we can do that in addition to perhaps seeking therapy and actually delving into the psychological wounding, or delving into what is the difficulty that I'm dealing with, or why do I see certain emotions and experiences as negative, right? And again, create this kind of binary where it's either or, right? And so I find that a lot of the time, and it's, when I think about it, I think, well, we, in the Almighty's wisdom, He created us as multidimensional beings. We have a spiritual, emotional, physical experience that we are having, right? And our emotions is part of that, right? There's a reason we were created with that experience. And if you think about it, emotion is the thing that gives life color. It's the thing that creates connection between two people, right? It's people's ability to listen to our conversation and connect to the words that we're saying or our expressions. So we don't think our connections, we feel our connections, right? And so we've got to create a space, I think, within our community where it's safe to have a feeling without it being judged, or someone saying to you, think positively, or someone saying to you, you don't have enough sabr. Maybe you should have more sabr. Or, perhaps you need to increase your dhikr. That's, again, all wonderful. But that's in addition to working with it. And I want to say, and I want to point out that Islamic spirituality is holistic. It includes ritual practice. It includes connecting to the divine, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And also it includes, us focusing on our interpersonal connections, right? And our practices. And so if you think about it, we can't deny. There are parts that we cannot deny. We cannot deny our emotional realm. In fact, can be seen as somewhat un-Islamic, because we again, it's a part of us. We acknowledge that. We think about the example of the Prophet ﷺ. He was someone who, he experienced the full spectrum of his emotions and he embraced it. We think about these often referral to his year of depression, when he had all those losses. And so, again, it's encouragement for us to just include that aspect of ourselves so we don't live split off from it, right? And relegate some of the parts of ourselves to the shadow. And the shadow is where our nafs lie.
Right.
But again, that's a whole other conversation.
Absolutely. We're chatting to Sister Shaamiela Safodien and having a wonderful discussion about spiritual bypassing. We are going to continue our chat just after the break. Thanks for watching us on Channel 347 on Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for joining us once again on Hilaal Live. We really appreciate it. Thanks for letting us into your homes. As we do on a Thursday, we chat to Sister Shaamiela Safodien, who is giving us valuable information and wisdom around spiritual bypassing. It's our show, Conversations with Insight. Shaamiela, Jazakallah once again for coming into studio and enlightening us on this very, very important topic. Yeah. Now, is it always negative practice to spiritually bypass? I mean, what are the impacts of using this as maybe a long-term coping mechanism?
I mean, look, I think I want to acknowledge that sometimes we experience distress as human beings and severe trauma. And so I think in cases like that, where it's a relief for an immediate or something that's too distressing, I don't think that's a bad practice necessarily. But I think what you mentioned is that it becomes a long-term practice that becomes problematic. Yeah. Because essentially what you are doing is it's just you're not paying attention to, again, psychological and emotional difficulties that you are experiencing. And so just embracing the nature of our human life as being that of a dual experience, that there's, we deem things negative and we deem them positive, but they're all really positive and for our growth. And so some of the consequences, I think, of long-term spiritual bypassing, and this is what I've observed as well, is that it often creates quite an intensified anxiety with people. Okay. And that because spiritual bypassing essentially is a defense mechanism and it's an avoidance technique, right? And so all you're doing is shoving things either under the carpet or to the back or into the deep recesses of your mind. It doesn't mean it goes away, right? It's still there. It lives in your body essentially.
Exactly.
And it comes up at some point. Right. So that's why I see increased anxiety, because there's things inside that's really wanting to push up and come through and move. And we're not allowing that because we're just saying, I need to be positive. I need to pray more. I need to meditate more. I need to go on a retreat, that kind of thing.
I need a holiday.
There we go. We vacate. So holidays are great, but you can't take a holiday from your issues every time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It still waits for you. It's there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's something to remember, is that it can lead to increased anxiety. What I also find is that sometimes people become, anything that lays in the shadow, as I mentioned earlier on, is that anything you're not dealing with is in your unconscious. And what happens with that is that we tend to unconsciously project onto other people.
Oh, yes.
So there's a lot of projection. Yeah. And so I may be intolerant of your emotional distress or the issues that you are dealing with. I may even judge it. These can sometimes be something like gaslighting and victim blaming, where people say like, oh, if only they were patient enough, or they say to a woman or a man who's in an abusive relationship that, try and work harder, try to connect to your partner a little bit more, try and, speak their love language, that kind of thing. And as a means to, again, sometimes people mean well, but as a means to dismiss the very real life experience that this person is having. And then what I've also seen is that it can hamper your growth. Yeah. So what's interesting about this is that we use spiritual bypassing as a way to only focus on spiritual practice. But we have to remember that when you bypass emotion, you bypass depth. You cannot have a deep experience if you're not connecting to your emotions, connecting to your body, and connecting to yourself, essentially, right?
Right.
So in actual fact, you want to have a deep spiritual experience, you need to feel your feelings, right? So you could actually be reaching a higher potential in terms of your spiritual practice, or connection to the divine and the Almighty, by actually allowing those feelings to surface, by acknowledging them and not relegating them to the negativity and saying that these are not things that I deal with, I'm above this feeling, So that's some of the things that I've said. And then what I've also seen is that we often have, sometimes in families, there are people that are, I'd say, conflict avoidant.
Yes,
or have,
that happens all too often.
Yeah, and conflict avoidant, or they have difficulty communicating and expressing or dealing with things that come up. Again, this is an avoidance and defense mechanism. And you'll find them often leave the home and go away to spiritual retreats, or go away, and involve themselves in spiritual practices, in groups and that kind of thing, instead of having the hard conversation.
Right.
Instead of dealing with a conflict in the home, instead of, meeting, let's say, your spouse or your child in that space, and having a conversation where we're acknowledging what's actually going on here. And so we can see that it can affect our interpersonal relationships, right? I mean, no one wants to be around someone who's always reminding them that, if I bring up my issue with you, that you're going to tell me that I'm being negative. And that I should think positively,
I get you. Fascinating. One of those conversations that's going to keep me up once again, because I have so many questions swimming around as well. But one of the questions I'd like to ask is, how do we begin to acknowledge our emotional realm? I mean, you mentioned that quite often as well. And maybe use our spiritual practice as a support, rather than using it as maybe an alternative.
Yeah. So I think about Anadonia Judith, and she's a woman who wrote a book called Eastern Body, Western Mind. And she talks about emotions having a spiritual aspect, and actually being the language of the soul. That's how she describes it. Emotions being the language of the soul, and that it speaks through our body. The language is spoken through the body.
Yes.
And so if you are interested in becoming a feeling person, of really like having a felt sense, as we describe it, it means connecting to your body. It means connecting to when something happens, when there's an incident, when something upsets you, if you feel angry, is noticing what happens in your body, right? Connecting to the feeling, connecting to the sense that you feel, having that felt sense in your body. And again, so emotions are essentially energy that needs to move.
Okay.
Right? And so when you think about, and I do this as well as a breathwork practitioner, we use breathwork as a means to access emotion and trauma.
Okay.
And so you'll notice that if we want to work with emotion or any kind of thing in the body, it requires movement, right? So we can move to help our emotions move. And so that's why exercise and movement or stretching or kind of gentle movement is important. And then if there is trauma in the body or in the nervous system, we often use movement as a way to access that and release it. Again, energy that needs to move. So that's how we begin. We begin by connecting to the body, acknowledging that we have feelings. And I think most importantly is the emotions and the feelings that we deem to be negative is to actually learn to invite them in.
Okay.
So things like, for example, something like anger, it's judged and it's something that we all have a negative connotation to. And I know from the Islamic perspective, we are told, control your anger, which I do acknowledge, but I don't think I don't think it means that you don't acknowledge it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. Gotcha.
I think it's about acknowledging that. And so I always say, anger created revolutions. You know, anger is our indication that boundaries have been crossed. And that's really important for us, right? Things like anxiety. What's my anxiety here to teach me? You know, what is my fear here to teach me? So beginning to connect to those things, and again, not splitting them off and saying, this is acceptable and that is not.
Right.
Yeah.
I got you. Now, as always, you bring in a wonderful quote for us, who one by Carl Jung, I believe you've got today as well. Would you like to share with us?
Sure. So the quote goes, emotions is the chief source of becoming conscious. There can be no transforming darkness into light and apathy into movement without emotion. Right?
Exactly what you said and explained to us just now.
So if you're someone who is, your path is self-awareness and consciousness, you have to acknowledge your emotion, right? It's the key. It gives you the information, you know, it tells you the stories you tell about yourself, the narratives you hold, the beliefs that you hold. And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to transform your life, your emotion is your gateway.
Right.
Yeah.
Are we ready though? You know, that's the big question that we need to ask ourselves. Are we ready to deal with that? Are we ready to acknowledge our emotions? Are we ready to acknowledge how it affects people around us?
Yeah. I mean, I think we are. In fact, I would actually go as far as saying we no longer have a choice, because we live in a world that, you know, it pushes disconnection. And so we've got to work at keeping the connection to ourselves,
Absolutely.
right? And keeping our souls, essentially. Yeah.
Shaamiela, thank you so much for coming into studio and enlightening us on a beautiful topic. And thank you for making our community aware of how to deal with certain aspects in our life as well. Have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Thanks very much. And that's how we end our conversations with Insight with Sister Shaamiela Safodien. I hope this was beneficial and informative to you. Very different Hilaal Live tomorrow. We'll be broadcasting from the Durban area, inshallah, for the soccer tournament. I think it's the AM soccer tournament. Hilaal Live will be there, inshallah, and over the weekend. So do join us for that if you're a soccer fan. Look out for all the highlights from the Hilaal team. From the Cape Town team for Hilaal Live, Sohail Barnes and myself, Luqman Shadrack, we wish you a wonderful evening. Assalamu alaikum.